Okay, thank you, Andy. Welcome everybody, thank you for coming along today. So I know we've got the sixth form here, we've got some other people I can see. Are you staff at the university or external or a bit of both, or students? Psychology students as well? So you're all in psychology as well? Oh, you're not all in psychology? A number of you are? A few of you? Yeah? I did a degree in psychology, which was really exciting. It does cover an awful lot of ground. So what tends to happen is you might find a particular interest in a certain field, and mental health is certainly one that grows. I know a lot of the universities are actually covering mental health specifically now at either degree or further level, so it's a really interesting field to get into. As Andy said, I'm sort of here with two hats. Unofficially, my Siemens hat, because I'm not here on behalf of Siemens. I do work in the rail sector. Siemens cover everything from medical equipment to wind turbines and renewable energy to rail industry and so on. So we're dealing with a lot of issues at the moment in terms of fatigue and stress management, which comes under sort of mental health. But also, as Andy mentioned, I'm the chair of something called the Lib Dem Mental Health Association. We did try and find a shorter name, but that was the best we could do. And the way it sprung up is, during the last government, I wanted to do some work on mental health. So I scrabbled around in my own party, so I'm in the Lib Dems, couldn't find anything specific. So I went to the Greens, and I went to Labour, I went to the Conservatives. Nobody had anything specifically looking at mental health. I don't know if you know how political parties work, but they have groups for everything. In my party we have the Lib Dem Friends of Palestine and the Lib Dem Friends of Israel, and there's elements to do with education, even the Lib Dem Friends of Pizza, which is a really good one. So they have lots of groups, but none of the parties had one on mental health. So I decided, do you know what, I'll start it myself. So I did. So we campaigned. Luckily, we were in government at the time. For those of you who saw the results in May, we didn't have a particularly great result, but should be better next time, I hope. And we got to work with a guy called Norman Lamb, who's been absolutely fantastic in terms of driving the mental health agenda forward. On top of charities, I always give a shout out to charities and organisations, campaign groups within schools and universities and community groups, because these groups have been screaming for decades for mental health to be taken as importantly as it is now. So really proud to be part of it, but as Andy and others will tell you, we've got so much more to do because we've just sort of tipped the iceberg. Is this going to work for me now? There we are. Does anybody recognise that particular set of numbers, that phrase? Can anybody tell me what it is if they recognise it? Yeah, go on.
1 in 4 people at some stage in their life will experience mental health disorder.
Yeah, so that's the phrase used by groups like Mind, for example, who are a mental health charity. I'm one of the few that sort of almost tells people off when they use it, because in my experience, it's just far too low. So when I come across my own experience or the experience of other people, whether you have direct personal experience with a mental health issue, which can last a day, or a week, or a month, or a lifetime, or whether it's a family member, or a friend, or a colleague at work, or anywhere, I find that that's just purely too low, because this is not going to work very well over here, is it? I might need to stand on this side. There we are. I wonder if it's actually this number here. I think 4 in 4 is probably a more accurate number to reflect the number of people who come into contact directly or indirectly with mental health issues. Because one of the things, I'll mention it a bit later on, we all have a mental health. Sometimes people only see people with issues as having mental health, but of course we all have it. And like we all have a physical health, I have a leg. It can be broken at any time. Anybody else who has a leg could have it broken at any time. So having a mental health is something we all have and something we all need to take more care of. So 1 in 4 is often put around as the number, but in schools I've been to, colleges, universities, workplaces, families, I've yet to find that only 1 in 4 people actually have had an issue or have helped somebody with one. So it's worth bearing in mind it can happen to many people. Can anybody guess what 70 million might refer to? And think of it particularly in the workplace. A wild guess. It's quite a big number. In 2013, it was shown that 70 million days across the whole year were lost across, this is obviously all businesses put together. So any category, the one you'll hear most is stress, which we'll talk about later on. But 70 million days in 1 year were lost down to mental health issues in the workplace. And some of it was down to lack of support, lack of understanding. So it's clearly a massive, massive issue. Most of this information, by the way, I'll just refer to, is here. Public mental health priorities. The Chief Medical Officer that reports to the government puts out an annual report. This was the last big one that looked at mental health. So you can find that online. So we discussed briefly who has a mental health. Well, if you didn't know already, it's all of us. So all of us in this room has a mental health. And it can sometimes be seen as just a problem for those people with mental health issues. But that's certainly not the case. It could be, so we've got acute and chronic. For those of you not aware, acute is very short term, and chronic is long term. A good example of that is chronic back pain. Somebody who has back pain for a long time is said to be chronic. And it can be minor to severe. Can anybody think of, when you think of mental health, we tend to think of particular illnesses. Can anybody shout out any words that you think of that are specific illnesses to do with mental health? Depression is probably the most famous one. Anxiety. Bipolar. OCD. Eating disorders, schizophrenia. There's lots of terms that we used to use that have now changed words as well that you may hear. But what tends to happen is something like depression, which is very real and very important, tends to cloud it when under the mental health umbrella, there's so many different issues that people can face. As I say, some people can face an issue that may only last a few days. That may well have been a mental health issue because you were dealing with things up here. And the one thing that we often forget, and I think sometimes can happen in the medical industry, is they do what they call medicalise the brain or the mind, and they forget that the brain and the mind aren't quite the same thing. So we can throw antidepressants at your brain and hope they fix your mind, but they don't necessarily do the same thing all the time. There are several hurdles in for support which are slowly beginning to break down. The first of which is a lack of understanding. This is either in yourself or a lack of understanding or empathy for other people. And it's not because you're malicious or you don't want to understand, but for years and years and years, we've had nobody really talking about mental health in public. So how are people to understand? I know a lot of schools and colleges and academies and universities that I work with are now putting things in. You're probably aware of PHSE, personal health, sexual education. So mental health, well-being comes into that. So if you can talk about it in schools to children and teenagers, you have more of an understanding as you grow up. But certainly education is needed. There may be a lack of support in the community. Some of you may be aware that there are quite big cuts that have happened and more coming potentially for local councils. What do they decide to cut? What do they keep? What do they get rid of? How do they afford them? This can also be through charities and third sector. One slight sideway that quite annoys me. Some of you may have been caught up in this debate against should the NHS be public or private. I've worked with some organisations that are technically private that can also be charities, such as the Children's Society, who do some amazing, amazing work, but they're technically in the private sector. So when you get caught up in this public versus private, remember there are two sides to it. The big one here, I don't know if any of you face this or come across this, is stigma. Now, in a way, these here about education, about supporting our community, we argue for more money, more resources, more training, more nurses, more professionals. But if the stigma is so high, the money won't get there or people won't talk out about their issues and go and look for help. Has anybody come across, not that you have to tell me the details, has anybody come across stigma or are you aware of it existing in terms of mental health? Yeah? So certainly in the past 3 or 4 years, I think, we've heard more about it. We're now getting celebrities and sports stars and musicians Norman Lamb, we mentioned earlier, he's an MP, and politicians are usually seen to be quite boring and not in touch with society, but he has been directly involved through his son in launching the career of Tinchy Strider, which is really good. So there's DJs connected to him that have come out and talked about their issues. Now, you wouldn't think a hip-hop DJ talking about mental health is a normal thing, but it's begun to happen. So we need more of that as well, because whilst we live in a culture that puts celebrities on a pedestal, if they can come out and talk about issues, other people think, well, I can talk about it as well. So it does help bring it out. But stigma is such a massive issue that we've got to tackle as a society. So experiencing issues, I like to use as few numbers as possible, but all the evidence shows, the main one is the second one, that before the age of 18, that's when about 80% of mental health issues can develop. And of course then the problem is they can last throughout adulthood. One of the big problems we've got in this country at the minute is a service called CAMS, which needs massive reform, sort of stops at 18. So if you're a 17-year-old and you kind of get told that next year you're 18, you'll be all right, you can go off on your own. Well, those of you who have been 18 or are approaching 18 realise that your brain doesn't work that way. You need continued support. So it's something we're tackling quite a lot. But if you've got people already facing issues at this age, that means that when they come to work for you post-18, they may be coming into your workplace with issues to deal with. And as I often find, one of my other hats I wear, another life I lead, is as a teacher, this wonderful phrase that students enter the classroom with their own worlds. How many students in this room have a situation where when you go to school or college or university, it's more laid back at university, it's come in, sit down, do your learning, take it all in, go away, do your homework, come back, do the same thing the next day. Well, you haven't got families to worry about, or building relationships, or discovering yourself mentally and sexually, and trying to maybe look for work. You've got all of these other things going on, and then you're told to sit down, shut up, and read a book and take notes. It's quite a lot to deal with, isn't it, well, at any age, but especially as a young person. So we need to realise by the time people come to work, they may already be facing issues. It may not be at the workplace that it develops. Everybody okay so far? Good. You're all awake still, just about, so that's a good start. So we can experience issues clearly in the home, in terms of where mental health problems can develop. Just shout out some random things to me. What other places or what other avenues can you gain mental health issues from? Workplace, clearly. Relationships, absolutely. Trauma, yeah, specific events in your life. Say again? Yeah, social life, yeah. So relationships kind of covers a lot, doesn't it? Because it can be a family, it can be sexual, it can be just friends, it can be colleagues, it can be all sorts of things. As a student, you face a lot of pressures and you face a lot of deadlines and you face a lot of stress. That up to 16, your whole life is about getting GCSE results, and then post that, is it work? Do I go here? Do I do what I want to do, or do I have to do what my parents think? Or again, a lot of stress is going on. It could be through the media. The media has a massive impact on us still. Print media less so, but websites certainly. So when you see something, we'll touch on this later, when you see something in the media, if it paints a negative picture about mental health, that can have a massive impact on how people perceive mental health. So we've mentioned different types of relationships, and of course in the workplace. For those of you who are either as workers or maybe you're supervisors or managers as well, have you ever come across the idea that when you come to work, anything that happens at home, you leave at home? Or when you go home, you're told to leave anything that happens at work and don't bring it into home? How feasible is that to do? No, not really, is it? I've yet to find somebody who can do it really, really well consistently. So what happens is all of these things get muddled up in our heads, and we don't know where to separate them, which is where, for example, counselling, which isn't effective in all areas, but counselling can sometimes help by unravelling all of this mess you've got in your head and helping you get to the core of the issues. So yeah, we can experience them, and other places as well. Somebody mentioned trauma quite rightly. You can have an event that happens that triggers something or compounds an existing problem. So the kind of issues that you could face in workplace, you have your job workload, you have the amount of work that you're given, the relationship you have with your colleagues, or Maybe the relationship you don't have with your colleagues, which can cause major issues. Relationship with your line manager, or a relationship you don't have with your line manager, can cause a massive issue. Outside influences, your overall health condition, going to work in a state that isn't 100%, you might be susceptible to issues that actually happen there. Life choices, so what diet do we have? Do we partake in exercise? Something I've just sort of made up recently, life load. So we talk about workload, we understand what that means. How much do we take on? So life load is how much we take on outside of work and have got a balance while we're inside of work. I suppose you could have student load as well, because you've got all of that to deal with. So your own life choices have an impact, and this is the one thing to be really careful of, is that you have a say in your mental health. There are external factors and things you can't always control, but you have a say in how you handle things and how you deal with events. And this is one of my favourites. Who's come across an HR department that's mentioned work-life balance? Anybody? Okay, it has the same HR department put programs out and training and massive support to be able to help you deal with your work-life balance. That's always the bit that misses, isn't it? So they talk about, sort your work-life balance out when they walk off. Well, how do I do that then? In my industry, so in the rail industry, it's a big issue because, as you may know, most trains run all of the time apart from Saturday night. So a lot of the work on repair and maintenance can only be done on Saturday nights. So people are doing overtime, they're changing from days to nights, which causes a problem with your physical and mental health. So this is a massive issue we're having to try and tackle at the moment. So work-life balance, again, is down to you. And some people are now going to look at me and go, well, this is easy for you to say, but I've done it with myself. If you're contracted to do this many hours, if you do this many hours, that is your choice to stay over. Now, I am aware, before you throw rocks at me, that there are pressures from your manager, your colleagues. Sometimes you may want to stay an hour over to get something finished so you haven't got to worry about it tomorrow. It's not to say never do overtime ever again, but to remember that overtime in most cases is actually optional. So again, it's about taking that personal choice, but it's about having the confidence to be able to do it, which is another thing altogether. So it's easy things. Check your work-life balance. How? Well, this is where you need, as we'll talk about active HR programs and so on. We talked about the media. Does anybody, not that specific plane, does anybody recognise this company, German Wings? Yeah? Well, how would you recognise it from the media recently?
The pilot that flew into the mountain.
Yes. Did everybody catch that? So there was a pilot who unfortunately flew the plane literally into a side of a mountain in, was it the Alps? And obviously everybody had died. Does anybody know why, other than plane crashes being horrific events, does anybody know why it became a big media story? Oh, a few of you. Yeah?
Basically, as far as I know, he was assessed to have mental health.
Yes.
And all the pressure was put on the whole firm. How could they let him?
Yes, absolutely. It was...
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. So it was the horror in 2015 that somebody with depression may have had a job. How dare they? Who do they think they are? Why does this company let somebody with depression have a job? One of the things we'll touch on later is that work may or may not help somebody who's been off with depression. You can't just throw somebody back into work, but it can be something you can look at. But this was just the horror that somebody with depression even dared to go to work. You know, what did they think they were doing? So I just pulled up some random headlines that I found associated with this particular issue. So they talked about a screening process that had to be rigorous. How do you screen somebody on a paper form for depression or a mental health issue? And again, depression took the centre stage. In this country, in the last 5 years, 350 pilots have been grounded, not allowed to fly because of mental health issues. And at first you think, big issue, we need more support. But then I start thinking, well, how were they assessed? Who decided what the issues were? Who decided they could be grounded? This is one of my favourites, they could retain their medical certificate to fly once they've made a full recovery from depressive illness. Is anybody aware of anybody here who has depression that is likely to, or has said, I woke up this morning and I've had a full recovery from my depression? It's not something I've heard of. Even if they manage it really well, it's something that can often lurk. They talk about clouds or shadows hiding around corners or something, so it's always there that can potentially come back. So it's the idea that you've had a tick from the doctor to say you're now fully recovered and everything's fine. And this, of course, they shouldn't have been at work. One of the more inflammatory papers mentioned this, and the editorial said, well, they shouldn't have been at work and putting all those passengers' lives at risk. There was then a question about the tablets they were taking, and the doctor's notes that they had, and the counselling sessions that they had. There are lots and lots of people that you will work with that may be having counselling sessions that you have no idea of, but you can work with them perfectly fine. A friend of mine recently, unfortunately, had a death of a colleague he used to work with, who literally jumped in front of an oncoming train, had a wife, 3 children, and everybody's response was, but he was always so happy. We couldn't see a problem. And this is one of the issues with mental health, is they're not big badges we go around wearing saying, hi, I've got a mental health issue. They're things that can often be hidden. The famous picture, if you Google this particular issue, is a guy taking a selfie in a mirror. Never seen one of those before, have you? And he's smiling. Well, what's wrong with him? It doesn't work that way. One smile on one picture does not mean that they have no issues. So this was very much a problem about the media portraying mental illness in a bad way that made people sit up and think, ooh, should he have been at work? I'm not so sure. Not because they're bad people to think that, but this was the only information out there. I did during that week, I did a radio interview talking about the opposite. Some members of Mind also did some, so I'm from Birmingham, in Birmingham and also around the country, talking about the fact that, whoa, hold back, we've got to talk about this as a sensible issue, not just say someone with a depressive illness cannot go to work. So there was a bit of kickback, which was good, but number of you put your hands up when you heard about this, so clearly it had a big impact. And the one thing I think is it became more about the pilot's depression and not about the 200 or so people who died in a plane crash. That was forgotten about. That's a plane crash. Yeah, so it's a big issue. So just as a quick question, in your organisations currently, or what you think should happen, what groups of people or specific roles or positions should be involved in creating a good place for your mental health at work? Everybody, yeah? Absolutely, I agree. Any specific roles that you might think have specific things to do?
Line managers.
Line managers, clearly, they've got people working for them.
HR.
Yeah, HR have an involvement, occupational health. But you're absolutely right, everybody has an involvement. So the first question is, what can we, because we are all at some point employees, which includes everybody like your line manager and the HR director and the CEO. And as we'll see, we look to the CEO and we look to the HR director to do things for us, but they've got a mental health that needs support as well. One big thing I do in sort of the education world is we talk a lot about students needing support, which they absolutely do, but let's not forget that the teachers are often the people that have their shoulders cried on, that they need support as well. So it's a big thing. So be self-aware. We talked earlier about if you feel you've got issues, you need to talk about it. And again, I can say here, just go and talk to somebody. You've got to be able to have the confidence to do that. And I think it's growing in society, but we've still got a lot to do. Do stay connected. I say this from personal experience. So I stood in the election in May. I've been working with some people to write some guidance for people who stand for election, because as politicians, as we get called, we're seen as these strange creatures that aren't human, that have nothing to do with the human race. We do have to develop multiple skins to deal with a lot of flack from the press and from people asking questions. But one thing that doesn't get considered really is the mental health of people who stand for elections, who become MPs. Could you imagine tomorrow if doesn't have to be the one we've got now, but a Prime Minister or a senior government minister stood up and say, hi, I've got a mental health issue? I think at the moment there'd be a massive kickback, certainly from some of the press, again suggesting, well, clearly they can't do their job. So it's a big issue we've got to focus. So staying connected with other people. I, earlier in my life, through bullying, was affected by depression as a young teenager. Mentioned earlier, I still have it now. I'm lucky that I've got the tools to manage it. But during the election period, I had a few days where I thought, ooh, can't handle this now. And I stopped talking to people, which if you ever have a mental health issue, please realise is the worst thing you can do. Here am I, a mental health campaigner, having done exactly the thing that I tell people not to do. And when you cut yourself off, you cut yourself off from your support. The minute you start talking to them again, it's like the sun comes from outside the clouds. So staying connected is a really key important thing. Do consider things like your diet. You can get easy advice off that. A lot of workplaces are doing sort of well-being programs now. Consider your activity. So during your lunchtime, you might often sit there with a bag of crisps and do your tweeting. Could you go for a little walk around campus or around your workplace? Could you go outside and get some air? Just something to try and give yourself a bit of a break. And consider other co-workers as well. There's a lot of advice you can get off this. Groups like mine actually do some good employment advice. It's the virtual hand around the shoulder. If you think somebody's got a particular issue, they might not want to talk about it, but just being there to say, everything okay? Do you want to have a chat? That can actually mean an awful lot to somebody at a particular time of stress. So as employees, as people, and somebody mentioned earlier, it's about all of us, we have a duty to ourselves as well. So we need to realise that we can do some things by ourselves. So line manager, somebody mentioned So a line manager, if you're not aware of the term, is basically anybody who's in charge of 2 or more people. So whether it's a manager or a supervisor, but line manager is the phrase we tend to use. So the goal here is to receive some training. What type of training do you think a line manager should receive in terms of mental health or well-being? Go on, someone have a go.
I'd suggest you can cover multiple directions.
Yeah?
I suppose encouraging staff to come, I'm being biased, at events such as these.
Yeah?
So it provides maybe a safe space to just to reflect. And then if they're wanting more bespoke stuff, it's look to the HR programs, more specific programs.
Yep.
Look around supporting someone with a mental health issue. Or other areas around well-being.
Yeah. So it's well-being is a good term these days because we often talk about mental health as being in its own little area, but of course well-being is physical, it's mental, it's stress, it's time management, it's fatigue. So well-being is being used in a lot of academy chains and education trusts at the moment as the well-being program actually covers your whole well-being, and it's how you can help yourself and others in that. So certainly with training, and one of the other things as well you can do is looking at how you can help line managers spot certain symptoms of certain issues. So for example, if somebody's having a particular issue with a dependency on drugs or alcohol, there are certain signs that to some of you in here who are aware of those are really obvious, but to a lot of line managers, if I become a line manager tomorrow, I don't know everything about managing people. I don't know about your experience. In a lot of businesses I've worked in, when someone becomes a manager, it is then assumed they know everything that a manager has to know. It's very difficult to do that, but it can happen. And also to offer training. So to make sure whether you do it or get someone to do it for you, make sure your staff has training as well. So monitoring, recording, coaching is a big word I use, coaching and mentoring. So you can give training to people, and it's great. So you can come to a session for 2 hours, great, I've been trained, off you go. Oh, well, I'll see you again next year. Well, no, you need that stuff in the middle. So coaching, mentoring, however you term it. And where necessary, you might need to escalate issues. Because as I'll touch upon in a short while, we've got to recognise that we can only help at a certain level. As much as we want to help that person so much more, we have to escalate or refer on. It's a difficult thing to do, but you do need to. Consider yourself as a line manager. Yeah, you're a supervisor, you're a manager, you've got a lot of your own pressures and deadlines and expectations. Well, you've got mental health as well, so you need to ensure that you're given support. The difficulty is when you get to the very top and you're the MD or something, or the CEO, where do you go? So there's quite a difficult level sometimes. And sometimes unions, be they in universities or colleges or workplaces, not all places are unionised, but union reps and unions themselves can offer training and support. So supervisors should, as they should do anyway, really work with unions as well to support their staff. So HR and Occupational Health I've kind of put together because they're not always in the same department, but they do sort of link together. There's a clear link there. Most companies I've worked in, occupational health tends to sit within HR somehow. So it's for you to develop policies and procedures and the training. So you can develop all the great policies in the world and all the great procedures, but you've got to actually enact them. You've got to put the support in place, the resources, the money. We mentioned about work-life balance. I've worked in companies that put big A3 posters up in colour. Check your work-life balance, and they put it on a notice board and think that's it. So procedures and policies are needed, but that's just the start. So support, often HR can get involved in conflict resolution. For those of you in jobs currently, do HR tend to be the people you go to when you have a problem? Yeah? My pay slip hasn't arrived, or so-and-so I think is bullying me, or so you tend to use HR as the support service, which they are there for, but you can go to them before issues escalate. One thing I don't know if you're aware of, most of you I think are aware of first aid training, which with my party hat on, we as a party managed to get introduced that all schools should really offer first aid. There is also now mental health first aid. It first started in Australia and it's available in this country. Has anybody come across mental health first aid? Oh, a few of you, good. So it's a great tool. Again, a lot of it is about signs, symptoms. You're not going to be qualified psychotherapists at the end of it, but it's just picking up those initial signs and symptoms, and if there's anything you can do straight away. So if you are involved in a workplace or a college or a school, ask about mental health first aid if it's something they can invest in, as well as first aid. So programs you can consider. Well-being, we've mentioned, it covers a lot of things. There's a lot of things you can do. Corporate memberships for gyms or swimming clubs or running clubs. There's one in Birmingham that does a rugby club. They do corporate sponsorship of it. So there's lots of things you can do. If you work in an office, giving people water, I know that sounds odd, or fruit. Yeah, it's something so simple. We brought fruit into our offices a few months ago, and the first week was all jokes about fruit. But after the second week, every Monday afternoon, those baskets are completely emptied because now everybody's eating fruit instead of a biscuit or a packet of crisps. That one tiny little change could make such a difference to your physical and mental health. So things like all vouchers to then go and get other things. Community activities. Some of you may be aware of CSR. What does it stand for? Go on, CSR, you know this one. Corporate social responsibility. That wonderful sounding thing. What it means is that companies, through their CSR program, should really consider their communities. Now often it tends to mean that they'll go out, help plant a tree somewhere and give a voucher of £100 to a local school, and that's it. They're good things, but there's so much more they can do. So working with your community can actually help people. So a litter pick, what on earth has that got to do with mental health? Well, research has actually shown that the more active people are who have mental ill health, the more active they become in their communities, the easier it is to sometimes help develop coping strategies. The fact that you're out there physically and working with other people and feeling that you're putting something back into the community, all of these things, it's been shown, can actually help improve your mental health. So if your company can sponsor that, that's a great start as well. These are the magic triangle, as I call them. I've worked in one company in my life, which unfortunately isn't this one at the moment, that has a nurse, a physio and a counsellor. They work there all the time, but the great thing about them is they all refer on to each other. So somebody with shoulder pain will initially have physio, and they might be referred to counselling because they think there's something underlying it, and it turns out they've actually got an issue to do with stress, for example, that is causing them to end up having a physical pain. So all of these three, if you can get those three in, that would be fantastic because they all work together in terms of support. So those of you in workplaces now, do you have occupational health nurses, or you have physios even, or occupational health nurses? Anybody working? The thing for these, they cost money, and this is the thing, it always comes down to that. And this is what often happens in public life, sometimes in the NHS, although it is changing slowly. A doctor, you go to a doctor, doctor, I've got this back pain, they give you some pills, and a week later you feel better. Great, we've helped them. Counsellor, I've got this issue. Right, you've had 6 sessions, we've paid for them all. Have you fixed the patient? It doesn't quite work that way. We're going to have to look at your funding next time. So it's a difficult thing, but if companies can, then that would be great. So senior managers, what do we think senior managers? So this is anybody at a top level senior management that's looking after a whole office or department or region. What can they do to help with mental health in the workplace? Talk about it, yeah. We mentioned stigma. Yeah, so there's a few things they can do. It's a wonderful phrase, this. To promote a psychologically healthy workplace. And I put this word here because in every business I've been in, I see this happening. Young people have to face it as students or outside, but also in the workplace, bullying can be one of the most horrendous things because most of the time people don't feel they can speak up about it. Or they feel they do go and speak about it and the HR department doesn't really know what to do. Or I've seen it, not where I work now, I've seen another company where the HR manager was good friends with the person the complaint was being raised against, so nothing really happened. These are horrendous things to think about, but unfortunately they really do happen. So it's really got to come from the top that this here is just unacceptable in any way, shape or form. Recently I do know that Siemens has updated its sort of inclusivity and diversity policy, which actually includes active words like stopping bullying or the phrase they use is often like conflict resolution. But a lot of companies now are active because they do realise ultimately, leaving aside the potential mental health issues, if you have somebody who's bullied badly and have to go off work, you've lost a worker, so what are you going to do? So it can sometimes come back to profit. Ensuring that support and training is available, that resources are allowed, that money is available. So these are things that senior managers need to offer. And then monitoring and management. So if you've got an active policy and you've just given your direct managers a big lesson on no bullying and stress management and so on, you've then, as a senior manager, got to be doing something about monitoring what they're doing or not doing. You can't just give them that session and leave them to it. You've got to actively get involved. That again is a big thing for a lot of managers, I find, but it's something they do need to do. And as I mentioned earlier, do remember we are not professionals. If you're dealing with somebody that you want to help, especially if they're a friend, it can be really difficult when you're at that point of realising really you can't help them any further. You don't know what words to use, you don't know if you're going to upset them more, and it's really difficult. I don't know if you don't have to say, obviously, I don't know if you've ever had a friend in that position where they might be crying or on the phone to you or saying things that you really want to help with and you're like, I don't know what to do. So there's got to be a level, especially in the workplace, that you might need to refer on. And this can be as a colleague, this can be as an HR person or occupational health. You need to realise that sometimes you've got to refer on. And referral is often external, so your GP is often a first port of call. I'll mention this wonderful word here called IAPT. Now, I know a couple of gentlemen at the front at least will have heard of IAPT. To the rest of you, it might be a bit of an alien concept. Has anybody else heard of IAPT? Yeah, a few of you, yeah. So IAPT has been developed over a number of years now. The big change that happened a few years ago is there was a significant shift to, sorry, I should start by saying what it is. It's access to psychological therapies, so what's called talking therapies often. It's important to remember that they're not applicable in all cases of mental health treatment, but they can help often. And the idea was that you can be referred. Now, a lot of IAPT centres, you can just walk in now. The goal is to have them all as walk-in centres. We're not there yet, but that's the goal. What can often happen with GPs is you can go on their list and you'll be here somewhere and you'll eventually get referred when there's a slot available because they've only got so much money to spend. So sometimes, and if you Google IAPT, it will tell you where your local centres are and if you can walk in. I know people who've been on waiting lists for GPs for 18 months and they've contacted the local IAPT centre, they had an appointment within 2 weeks. And just that massively sort of helped them deal with some issues. So other local services, I won't go through them all, but through your council you can contact. I know in Birmingham we have a specific mental health team now within the council itself, so you can contact them for further support. Caring services, there's lots of additional types of service. Go through local charities because of course they will, or national ones, they'll guide you to relevant places as well. Samaritans and groups like that, of course. We mentioned private provision. Sometimes it's provided in work. If it isn't provided in the work you are now, go back and argue for it. But do know your limits. This is the big key. It's really, really difficult. I've been through it myself, where you want to help people and you've just got to realise, no, I've got to stop there, because you might unintentionally end up causing further issues. So you've really got to realise at some point the professionals need to take over. The difficulty at the moment can be when you get to them and they're waiting 6 weeks to see somebody. So we've got a lot of work again to do on that socially, but things I do believe have changed over the last few years. Bit on workplace stress. Who can tell me what stress is? You've all heard of it, I'm guessing. What is stress?
Perception that you can't manage.
Brilliant. Yeah, it is a perception. Were you going
I'm
to?
going to say it's sort of pressure taken to the level where it's
Yes.
agenda, there's too much.
Yeah. So there's a lot of confusion around stress. Part of the reason due to some doctors, which I'll come on to in a second. So, and that's the key thing, it's the belief. It is a key perception that the workload, or I said a word of life load or student load, whatever you want, that the stuff you're getting to do is just becoming too much. And again, I'll say from personal experience, it can be down to you. So I know in the past I've taken on far too much, because we often in life think the word no is difficult. We think the word yes is difficult, when the word no is actually harder. We find it very difficult to say no to somebody asking for help. The problem is, when you've said yes to 17 people, you've then got 17 extra things to do. So do try and realise that you've only got so many things you can balance. And it is a symptom. It is not actually a medical diagnosis. You can't go through a nursing qualification and find out that stress is a specific medical problem that you can assign to people. The problem that you have is that you can see stress written on a doctor's note. I don't know if any of you have been involved with occupational health at work, or you've maybe been through your doctor. The number of doctor's notes I've seen over the last however many years I've been involved in occupational health, that is the doctor's handwriting, which can sometimes be difficult enough to read as it is, and it just says stress. That's it. That's all they've written on. The person's gone in, explained their issues, and it says stress, and then they're off work for 3 weeks. Hang on, how on earth have you come to that conclusion? So it isn't actually a medical diagnosis, but it can be on a doctor's note. So can a doctor successfully determine that your workplace has caused you the stress that you're currently facing? Maybe not always. There's a nice on-the-fence response. They aren't there. They aren't with the people that you're working with. They're taking everything you're saying on face value. If you're going through stress, are you going to be calm and rational and explain everything? Or is everything going to be coming out and it's all terrible and awful? And so the doctor's having to take one side of the argument. It's also the case of, well, what next? Because the doctor writing stress on, great, thanks, next patient. Well, that person's now gone away. So it's not necessarily helpful in all cases. Some cases, that person might need to come out of the workplace, which we'll discuss. So what can be done to help manage? Again, we're looking towards groups like HR, Occupational Health. So conflict resolution we keep mentioning, but if you can try and stop an issue escalating too high, you can try and stop it from getting to a crisis point. Coaching, mentoring, supporting, training. Do a work assessment. Look at where they work, the number of hours they work, the department they're with, the group of people that they're with. And all of these things you can actually assess. It's not the case that in every scenario you can just move this person from here to here and everything's fine, but it's an option to look at. And do again refer on where they need to. Line managers, we've mentioned various things. Show an active interest. Doesn't mean you need to know everything about every detail of their life, but show an active interest in your staff. Support again where you can, refer on again where you need to. Keep mentioning that. It's important that referral services are used. So what could it result in? Well, clearly initially for the business you can have your quality of work suffered, so the business is affected because you're being stressed. Loss of confidence to be able to do certain things, and the next time you go to do that job that you're less confident and you might cause an issue. It could affect others. And then absence is the big one. This is where HR will often come in and have absence management policies and procedures. It does affect you, of course, because you're the one off work. The longer you're off work, if you stop having sick pay, who's paying the bills? And there's a lot involved with being off work. Sometimes it's, they're just off because they don't want to be here. They're just skiving. And absence can actually be a really horrific time to go through. It then can affect your friends and your family and maybe carers, who then have to do more work to support you, and they'll do it because they want to and they love you, but it does put more stress on them that they then have to deal with. It can then, of course, affect your co-workers, because one less person at work means that you've got more work to do. And if you imagine you're in a small business and there's only, 6 of you, one person being off for a long time can have a massive impact. So lots of people are actually affected by absence. And the other thing I find with absence is that HR can often come in with you've been off for this many times, we might have to look at a disciplinary hearing. If you're already in a bad state mentally, to then hear that D word could potentially set you off further. So it's not always handled in the best way. So things you can do with absence management, can they be brought back into work? It's a question to ask. Please remember, I think Andy was saying this was mentioned this morning, just saying, right, you've been off work for a certain time, just come back into work now. It's not necessarily the thing to do straight away. Because one of the problems that can happen is that them being off work means they're away from the issue that might be causing them stress. But then, whilst they're off work, they're sitting there getting anxious about coming back to work, going back into the same place where they developed their stress in the first place. So it's a very difficult thing to do. Again, you can do things like, well, do they have to go back into the same place? Consider the colleagues they're working with. Are they the right colleagues? Consider a phased return. Somebody might come back for 2 hours on one day a week and phase it in. So I can't tell you here how to do all of your absence management, but they're just the kind of questions that HR departments will ask, because having somebody off for a period of time with a mental health issue and then just bringing them straight back to work is probably not the best thing to do. But you need to involve the person, and sometimes, again, that can be quite standoffish. They can be looking at their procedure rather than considering the person that's going through the issues. You could lower their workload or change. I've seen cases where jobs were changed to a lower workload. It can happen. Have you come across this wonderful phrase of reasonable adjustments? I'll touch on that in a second when we look at the law. And the big key, and as a party, and when we're in government, we were looking at this in terms of, it's all well and good if somebody's back at work. The key thing is, how do you help them stay there if that's the right thing for them? Because there is a bit of an issue sometimes, and maybe the Department for Work and Pensions is sometimes a bit guilty of this, of saying, they're back at work now, right, on to the next issue. Well, actually, no, if that person is back at work and you phase them in, you've got to support them. They can't just be left to their own devices. You've got to really support and help them. So can they be brought back to work is a question for the company and the individual to work together on. Not something I can say here, yes or no. It's a really difficult thing to work through. And so clearly, is work the cause of the issue? Is it making issues harder? Is it a hindrance? How do you support them? Sometimes, certain jobs, you could work from home for longer, so that the point is you've just got to ask so many questions, but you've got to involve the individual. Don't just refer to your HR book. So briefly, the legal position, there are a few pieces of law to consider. The Equality Act is the big one. This brought together the Race Relations Act, the Disability Act, and so on, all together as one, and it talks about reasonable adjustments. If somebody's had a physical injury, they've had a back injury, and they're working at a desk, you will consider their seating position. That's a fairly easy one. If they've got a mental health issue and they're coming back to work, it isn't just a case of moving the monitor and giving them a wrist rest for their mouse. Not quite as easy as that. But reasonable adjustments have to be made. You may have heard of the Health and Safety at Work Act. There's nothing specific in there, but there are legal obligations on you as employees and employers to manage a person's health, not just their safety. And then the management regulations talk about risk assessment, and risk assessment is being used more and more for mental health. In the rail industry, our big one is fatigue at the moment. There was a famous accident, some of you may remember, in 1988, Clapham Junction, and the big thing that was put down to was fatigue of the workers. It's taken until 2014 for the government and Network Rail to push that forward, so we're having big changes on working hours and so on. But assessment is really important. The big key focus is to try and avoid stress audits. Here, fill this form in, tell us how stressed you are. Well, you've just given me a form to fill in, that's a 10 straight away. So stress audits are advised away from, because they're not necessarily the best tool to use. It's down to you as an organisation to decide what is best, but stress audits are always argued away from. Has anybody ever come across a stress audit? No, you have? How did you find it?
I wasn't stressed at that particular time.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, it's as and when. Yeah? Bit like an MOT, isn't it? It's only useful for that point. And then stigma, I think the stigma is finally dropping away from mental health. There's a lot of caveats in that, but it seems to be getting a bit easier for people to talk. So it's now a mainstream topic. I certainly know that the work we did with Norman Lamb and some of the other members of government, when it was first talked about, the media loved it because it was a new story for them to get their teeth into. But it's still talked about now. It's a mainstream issue. The phrase I use is no longer will we say it's just for those people in that little white house on the hill over there. They've got mental health issues, leave them in there and they'll get better soon. It's all of us. It's in our communities and schools and families and businesses. It's everywhere. So we mentioned earlier, lots of people speaking out, potentially something on that soon, so keep your eye on the media. Print media is seen to be largely stigmatising. A recent study showed that about 80% of stories in print media, so that's your papers and magazines, are still negative about mental health. Mention the words mental health and there's oh dear, that person's got mental health, they must be a bad person. It's come up again actually, even the great Barack Obama has been tackled on this in the last couple of weeks, because he talked about, there's been another shooting in America, and they were speaking about how the person may have had mental health issues, and it was spoken about quite negatively. I think they're slowly realising there's a joined up issue there. No head clutchers. I worked with our party and we changed our pictures. Head clutching, Stephen Fry famously did a campaign on this. This is the picture you will see associated with mental health. The minute you look at it, you do start to feel. Yeah? So one little thing we did a news story and it featured this picture, and it was on some good work we had done with the Time to Change campaign, which I'll mention shortly. And the next story we did, we changed it to that picture. I don't know if you can quite see very well. It's like the sun just breaking through some trees. And now, it doesn't specifically, you don't look at that and go, oh, mental health. But what a difference it is to somebody sitting there like this. Or often you see the boy on the stairs like this. And it's just, let's get away from even negative images. Just makes a person feel quite negative about the subject. So Time to Change is run by Mind and Rethink. It's government funded, which I hope continues. We will be pushing for it on all sides. It is community-led as well, so it's national campaign, but they also do a lot of community work. They did a great trial programme in Birmingham, which found that when they spoke to young children, so this was sort of under the age of 10, as well as young teenagers, that the children, even in terms of how they spoke to each other in the playground, when they thought there was an issue, the way they spoke to other children, which was more of a, are you okay? Which was just a phenomenal thing to see. What they then found is that when they went home, they actually changed their parents' perceptions of how to deal with people when they're suffering issues, or looking at bad behaviour. Don't just, being a child, being bad. Well, actually, there's a reason they're acting the way they are. So, really, really fantastic work. Time to Change, you can easily Google it. There is a big focus on young people and families, because that's the core of the work, but they do a lot of other work as well. And they are finding that their work is improving attitudes towards mental health, which is fantastic. I will make a specific call out here. If you're in a company or you have parents or friends that are in, tell them to look up the employer pledge. It's easy to find on the Time to Change website, and you can commit your organisation to being part of Time to Change. And again, it's for them, that organisation, to carry on working. They don't just sign this and forget about it. But it's certainly something I'd encourage you to look at if you're in a company. So, almost bang on. The work is then for us to do, whether it's as politicians, as members of community groups, charities, families, friends, schools, colleges, universities. Mental health is something we all have, and it's something that we all really need to focus on. So thank you for staying awake. Is there any particular questions or comments people want to make?
No.